So our last speaker, before we hit the lunch break, he has, I think, in terms of my prep, it was the shortest introduction for me. So two massive accomplishments. He co-founded the premier UX consulting company called Adaptive Path, and he co-authored the book Org Design for Design Orgs. He'll be talking about the 4 archetypes of design leadership. We have Peter Merholz. Let's have a big round of applause. Thank you.
Designers were millennials before there were millennials. People are not their job titles. Team members are not resources. People work best when they can be their full selves. If your team's work isn't good, you didn't set clear expectations. Bad design is the result of context, not individual aptitude. If you focus on the organization, quality will take care of itself. Design quality is subjective. You cannot calculate an ROI for design. You will spend more time in spreadsheets than design tools. Opening a production design tool is likely a sign of failure. Framing the problem is more important than solving the problem. Design leadership is more talking than doing. You'll do a better job if you lighten up. If you haven't pissed someone off, you're not doing your job right. For someone who talks a lot about empathy, you show little for your colleagues. No one outside your team understands what it takes to do good work. The outcomes are better when everyone is a designer. Design is interesting because it is different. Agile transformations are hostile to good design. Introversion inhibits design's ultimate impact. What a design team needs most is a clear sense of purpose. A design team without a charter is a team overwhelmed and underappreciated. Making an effort to connect to business value goes a long way. You are on the front line of a global war for talent. Everyone applying for a role has an inflated title. Interviews are a poor way of assessing candidates. Design exercises are a bad interviewing practice. You will never have enough designers. You will never have enough time. The skills that got you here are not the skills that will carry you forward. I'm Peter Merholz. I'm going to give a talk addressing the fact that the skills that got you here are not the ones that are going to carry you forward. The name of the talk is Coach, Diplomat, there we go, Champion, Architect. The 4 archetypes of the complete design leader. Thank you for putting up with that. I used to do that at the end, and I thought I'd pull it to the beginning and weird you out a bit. I hope it worked. Yeah, we got some bottom of the screen stuff. You know my name, that's my Twitter handle, that's my new URL. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that design leaders face, particularly as they start shifting from being in a designer mindset into a design leader mindset. And this framework I developed as a way to help design leaders navigate their new role and new responsibilities. Key for design leaders to embrace is what Obi-Wan tells Luke at this very moment. You can kind of see him having a realization. Does everyone remember what Obi-Wan tells Luke at this moment? Anyone want to shout it out? Let go. Design leaders have a hard time letting go of the work, being in the work, doing the work. That is not your job as a design leader. Your job as a leader is to provide leverage, to leverage yourself. Leadership is about leverage. It is about how you enable your team and your broader organization to do great work. It's not about you doing great work. So you have to develop a set of skills and practices that allow you to be leveraged. When I talk about these archetypes, you have your design leader, that's you generally, or you soon. I think we have some folks who might not yet be leading or managing teams, but are curious as to what it entails. The coach is managing down, right? Getting the most out of their team. The design leader also has to manage across. That's what I refer to as the diplomat. And then a design leader needs to manage up, what I call the champion. We'll get to architect later. So, coach. What does it mean to be a coach? What does it mean to manage down? What does it mean to get the most out of your team? So, the primary responsibility for a coach is to help their team understand what success looks like, to articulate a vision for success. Again, not to do the work that leads directly that leads to success. The way it often happens is the design leader kind of tells the broad story, stubs out the main scenes, and encourages the team to fill in the details. It's important for the design leader, and this is true across any kind of leadership role, particularly in product development, but it's important for the design leader to focus on outcomes, not output. We heard a little bit about this earlier when Daniela and Karin were talking, and it's like, if we're achieving the goal, that's the point, right? We are hitting our outcomes. It's not important that, it's not as important that someone gets all worked up about the specifics of the output. And if it is achieving the outcome goals, that is what you are aiming for. But, and I was heartened to hear Daniela and Karin talk about this as possibly the single most important thing, because it's something I've realized more recently a lot of design leaders fail at, is setting clear expectations. A lot of design leaders know what they want, but don't tell people what they want. When then their team does work, they don't like the work, they get mad at the team, but the team didn't know what it was that was expected of them. And so you get it, frankly, it's an abusive relationship then between the design leader and the rest of their team. So you need to be upfront, setting clear expectations as to what you, setting clear expectations as to what quality looks like, what success looks like, all of those things. That's your responsibility. One of the truisms, if you're seeing bad design, it's probably because you didn't set clear expectations. It's not your team's fault. Similarly, if you're seeing bad design, I had that it's about context, not individual aptitude. Too often, I've been asked when I've joined a new team, and I have seen others asked when they join a new team, well, as a design leader, there's some people, they're not very good. You're probably going to need to manage them out. One, you're like, thanks for that, for making it my problem when you knew it was a problem before I joined. It's part of the work of leadership, though. But pretty much every time I've seen that, the designer is actually perfectly capable. But they're working in a bad context. They're working in a challenged relationship with cross-functional peers, or their manager isn't giving them the support they need. And once I am able to address the context, all of a sudden, good design is flowing. And it's so easy to want to point at bad apples. One thing if you take away maybe nothing from anything I say over the course of the next prior 15 and next 30 minutes, is most problems are systemic and are a product of the system that they are within, as opposed to blaming individuals. Blaming individuals will not get you very far over time. It's also, so the design leader as a coach is helping set expectations, helping the team understand what success looks like, and then helping them, in order to help them get there, the design leader then shifts into providing guidance. Again, I get wary when design leaders start rolling up their sleeves and doing the work. But there's definitely a role that design leaders play in helping the work advance. This first line, go from 10,000 feet to 1 foot without getting the bends, is kind of one of these other design leadership truisms, but I wasn't able to frame it like the others. You're going to find yourself as a design leader dealing with the big picture strategy of the company in one session, and then you're going to be in another meeting, and you're going to be dealing with pixel perfection, 20 to 24 pixel padding, as we heard, and you're going to be bouncing back and forth between those. That's part of your job now. You have to be able to operate at multiple levels of scale and not get vertigo, not get thrown off your game. Design leaders, I think, kind of obviously, they have a responsibility for leading critique. Sometimes companies don't like the word critique because they're sensitive snowflakes. They'll call it feedback or reviews or whatever, but critique, I think, is a perfectly good word, but then again, I have low inherent empathy. But it's important for that critique to be constructive. I'm not going to give a lesson on teaching critique or conducting critique. There's 1,000 resources you can draw from out in the world. But I do want to say one thing about the leader's role in critique that I think is crucial, and it's the last few words there: leaders speak last. When I was at Adaptive Path, I'm one of the founders of Adaptive Path. The founders, there were 7 of us. We were equal partners. So we would go at it, right? We would tear one another apart around our design work, and that was fine. That was how we engaged. Then we started growing, needing to bring on new folks, and I wanted to engage. Initially, I wanted to engage in the way I always had. So someone shows me stuff, and I'm like, "Have you thought?" or "What about?" And I'm getting in the mix. And it took a colleague of mine to pull me aside and say, "You can't do that. The moment you talk about a design, there is no more conversation." I'm like, "What? I'm just me. I'm part of the team." "No, you're not. You're the founder. You're one of the leaders here. People take what you say as direction. Even if that's not how I intended it, that is how it is being received." And so you have to be mindful of how you are being received as a leader and what impact you're going to have. And I think a heuristic is to speak as little as possible and as late as possible. Oftentimes you'll find your team will have come up with whatever it was you wanted to say, but now they get to own it instead of it feeling like it's direction from you. And then what also happens, and this is where your wisdom and expertise as a design leader, as someone who's seen a lot of problems, comes into play, is when your team gets stuck, and teams will get stuck. And the junior design leader, the new design leader, when the team gets stuck, they try to throw more design at it. They just kind of keep generating stuff in hopes that it'll, like, I don't know, break a log jam and goodness will flow again. That almost never works. The solution, I can't think of a time when the solution to a problem I was seeing from a design perspective was just hammering away at it with just more iterations, basically following the same path. Instead, think about how you can help pull the team back and reframe the problem. How can they tackle it from a different viewpoint? Maybe they need to stop doing design and engage in another activity. They need to talk to some users and get out of their head. Maybe they need to get out of their production tools and do a sketching session for a couple hours and exercise different muscles. Maybe you need to bring other designers in and turn it into, at Adaptive Path, we had something called the open design session, where every project team could introduce could bring their hardest problem that they were facing to the whole company. And other designers would come in for an hour or two And you'd get fresh perspectives, and then that would often help the team kind of think about a new direction forward. So figure out ways to reframe a team's approach to a problem if they are stuck. So design leadership is a lot about striking balances between opposing forces. I think that's something we heard earlier today. I definitely got that from Karin and Daniela's conversation. It came up a bit yesterday. And the most common opposing force, and I'm not going to actually get into it today, but for example, is quality versus speed. That was a little bit of what Jared was getting at, right? We recognize that speed is important, that shipping is important, that you don't know anything until you get people using the thing you're building, but we also recognize quality is important. If you ship something before it's ready, the feedback you get might not actually be all that germane to whatever it is that you know you could be doing. And so striking those types of balances, that's a design leader's role, is figuring out how to manage those, weigh those options and chart a path forward. When it comes to coaching your team, I think there's an interesting balance around, you need to let your team mess up. You need to let your team try things and fail and learn. That's how we learn. Too often I've seen design leaders seeing something not great about to go out the door and swoop in and take the files and pretty them up, go from the 24 to 20 pixels or tighten up the typography or whatever it is, and then that's what gets shipped. And sure, maybe it works, but now the team member has been disempowered for one thing. They're like, well, that wasn't mine. But they haven't learned. They haven't learned that if they did the thing they were going to do, it wasn't going to work. Often, of course, what we see is that if they did the thing that they were going to do, it actually works out okay, and that design leaders tend to try to prevent problems that aren't actually going to occur. But you need to let them mess up. You need to let folks learn from their own mistakes, because if you keep swooping in, that becomes a crutch. They start relying on your input to solve their problems instead of developing that muscle of how they're going to solve it themselves. That said, one of the challenges that design leaders face is balancing letting people mess up and learning and growing in that way while holding them accountable. Team members will recognize if someone is sliding, right, is not pulling their weight, but it doesn't seem to be a problem, and they're just getting by, and other team members will be like, oh, so I can put in less effort and be okay? Well, you don't want to set a culture of that. So this is kind of related to setting expectations. You need to make clear what is acceptable within your organization. What is it that you're expecting from your team members, so that when they're measuring up, you can give them plaudits, and when they're not, you can then engage them in coaching and correctives. You also have to avoid what Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor, refers to as ruinous empathy. Designers are really good at ruinous empathy. Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about it. And then behind their backs, oh my God, what are we going to do? That doesn't allow your team to grow. That makes it take much longer to get everything done. It's actually part of the critique process. Needs to be a way to be direct. And so as a design leader, you can't dodge difficult conversations. One of the truisms is, if you haven't pissed somebody off, you're not doing your job right. Can you imagine? I mean, I bet you all did. How hard it was for Daniela to let off half of her team? That was, I'm sure, exactly the right decision. I'm hoping the company did everything it could, it sounded like, to try to either find new roles for them in the company, give them good severance packages, set them on their way. But as a leader, you are going to make decisions that upset people, piss them off, whether it's your team or your cross-functional peers. That is the job you are signing up for. If you are striving to be likable and want everyone to love you, you are not suited to be a leader. And you should find a different way of working. Leaders are going to be pissing people off. Just that's the job. So that's a little bit about coaching. Now we're going to look across and talk about what does it mean to be a diplomat, that archetype of the design leader, working cross-functionally to try to ensure design's voice, your team's voice in this broader conversation. And the key element of this is engaging with non-designers. Much of your job, design leaders, again, don't realize this designers don't realize this as they become design leaders, much of their time is spent not engaging with designers. In the technical context that many of you in, it's product management and engineering, it might be marketing and sales, data analytics, executives, we're gonna touch on that in more depth later. As the truism said, design leadership is more talking than doing. And so you need to be comfortable communicating and reaching out to people who aren't designers and understanding their perspectives. I was serious when I said designers talk a lot about empathy but don't show very much for their own colleagues. They love their users. They'll die for their users. But when a product manager wants to change something, oh my God, what's wrong with that person? Who are they? How could they possibly think that was the right thing to do? But if you were to interview that product manager, you'd be like, well, that person's been told by an executive that this is what they need to do. And when they hear from the designer, why? The product manager, because my ass is in a sling because an executive is demanding that we launch this feature, right? So develop that understanding and empathy for your peers, for your cross-functional peers. Where are they coming from? What is it that they're trying to get done? Learn their language. Designers get very caught up in our own argot, jargon, our practices and methods and processes and personas and journey maps and all this kinds of stuff. And we can start sounding like the grown-ups in the Peanuts cartoons to others as we start getting too kind of in the weeds with how we do our work. So try to engage without using designer jargon. And then key, and this is something that I've had to elevate more recently as I've been working with design leadership teams, trying to help them be better at their job. Designers, and thus design leaders, because most design leaders were former designers, bias towards introversion. I don't. And so it's taken me a while to appreciate just how deeply introverted most designers are. And what I have seen, and this is not fair to introverts, and life is not fair. What I have seen is that introversion inhibits that design leader's success, inhibits their team's success, because there'll be some cross-functional meeting of leaders, and the product people are talking, and the engineer is talking, maybe you got product marketing people, and they're all talking, and the design leader's just sitting there listening, kind of, You gotta speak up. You gotta be heard. You gotta overcome your own introversion. If not for your own sake, for the sake of your team. That is your responsibility now. I wish this wasn't the case. I wish corporate environments could enable all types of communication and ways of being and neurotypicalities and atypicalities, but it doesn't. And so as a design leader, you need to figure out how to find your voice in these cross-functional conversations, and so that your team is well represented and you are advancing your agenda. Oftentimes when companies embrace design, they start with some type of agency model, internal services model. And I've seen more than once design leaders coming out of an agency world into internal design, and not only setting up their team as an agency, but as a black box, where they're not collaborating all that directly with engineering peers, with product peers, marketing peers, et cetera, that everything has to kind of get funneled through the leadership layer before it gets to the team. And they're doing this as a way to maintain quality, to protect quality. But it becomes seen as, internally this ends up inevitably being seen as damage that just gets routed around. And the other teams just stop engaging with design if it's too hard to do. You're seeing this less and less, but I think it's still worth calling out because I've seen it not as long ago as I would have hoped. And more recently, I found myself in conversations with teams where they're having to talk about intake. I can kind of buy talking about intake if you're a marketing design team, a communication design team. You got a lot coming at you. It's a quick turnaround process. I'm not thrilled with it in that context, but I kind of see it. But if you're in product design, if you're in UX design, and you need to have an intake model to manage the work you're doing, that's broken. That's basically a symptom of a broken relationship. That means that design is not part of the right conversations up front with product leadership and engineering leadership about what's happening. And instead, design is kind of receiving. We got all these projects, and the designers have to figure out how to prioritize which ones they're going to work on. That's, if that is your context, that's broken, and you need to figure out how to unbreak that. People have questions about it. We can talk about that if we have time for Q&A. I seem to have 32 hours, according to this, so we'll see how this goes. The countdown stopped, so, but I'm being mindful of time. Not that I care about lunch. I can hold you here as long as I want. Did I mention I'm not naturally empathetic? So another balance to be struck now when you're, as a diplomat, when you're working cross-functionally, and I touched on part of this before. Oops, oh well, you see both sides. Assuming positive intent, right? Too often, when you're not empathetic to your colleagues in their situations, we assume that they are out to get us, that product manager wants to make my life miserable, and that's why my team is having to work too hard, that the engineering leader's just saying no because they're a jerk, et cetera, right? Like, it's very easy when your team is in a challenge situation to assume what are labeled here as victim stances. Oh, no one understands us, no one gets us, they're asking us to do too much, they don't understand what it takes to do good work. That is all probably true, but you have two things. One, it doesn't help anyone to assume a victim stance. It just doesn't. That's a non-starter from step one. But two, they all have their reasons, and they're probably really good reasons. There's likely broader, bigger challenges within your organizational context that has led them to behave the way they are leading. But everyone wants the same thing. Everyone wants to deliver great customer experiences, right? This is something Karen was talking about, pointing up there because she was sitting up there. I don't know if she's still sitting up there. That was something that Karen was talking about, right? When they wanted to, when she's at Wells Fargo and she's like, everyone here loves customers. Why is what we're producing for customers so bad? Right? There's something that's happening internally that is leading to that outcome. It's not because of people's desire. So if you can assume positive intent, that means you can start working together to solve these problems instead of working at odds. That said, I've too often seen design leaders in a desire to work together, in a desire to be seen as a team player, in a desire for design to have that seat at the table that Jared told us doesn't actually exist. I've too often seen design leaders accommodate the dominant cultural paradigm of whatever company they're coming from. So what do I mean by that? If you're in an engineering-driven company, designers just start working in 2-week sprints because that's where an agile company and everyone else is doing 2-week sprints, so we're going to do 2-week sprints. And don't push back on it because then you're going to be seen as a squeaky wheel or a problem, and we have to be seen as team players. If you're in a more business-led company, MBA-led company, designers, all they're doing is talking about metrics and how we're driving conversion rates and engagement rates and retention rates and all that kind of stuff. And it's not to say that those things aren't important, but that is not why you have been brought in. That is not why design exists in those companies. Design exists in those companies because it's interestingly different. It's a different way of framing and solving problems than those other ones. And if all you do is accommodate to that, whatever that dominant paradigm is, you've just made your team's value much less. You've just turned them into typically some type of mechanized workforce for producing assets. And so you have to, this is why one of those truisms was around, a couple of them was around charters. I have become a firm believer in the importance of charters. A design team needs to know what it stands for, understand its mission, vision, values, purpose, their own measures of success. Possibly my favorite talk yesterday was a little bit overshadowed because it followed Jared Spool, but was Jen Cardello's talk on building her research organization at Fidelity. She gave you a playbook that is rock solid for any design organization, possibly any kind of team. And one of the things she talked about was charters. I was like, yes. When you have a charter, you now have a platform to stand on to better engage with the rest of your organization. Anne mentioned that at Pinterest as well. And so you need to have that foundation that allows you to engage with your peers and help them understand where you're coming from and why you're doing things differently than maybe they would like, but why you think it's also going to be, why it's the better approach, why it's more effective. Because ultimately, as design leaders, you need to make sure you're keeping design weird. Design is interesting because it is weird, because it is different, because it is a stereotypically right-brained approach, generative, creative, exploratory, in what is typically a left-brained corporate world of analytics, reduction, mechanisms, productivity, right? And so part of your job as a design leader is to fight for the weirdness of design, because that's what actually makes it valuable. It's hard because it's also what frustrates your colleagues, because they don't get it, they don't understand it. Why are you being so weird? Why do you have to do things differently? Why is it taking you longer? Why can't you just behave like we do? And the answer is because then you don't need us. You're already doing that. What you need actually a different way of engaging and figuring out a way to bring those together. Okay. I'm going to have to talk a little bit quicker. So champion, fighting for your team and your function. So this is about managing up, primarily, kind of managing up and out. I talked about the need to communicate, and this is one of those challenges that introverted design leaders have. You've got to evangelize your team's good work. You've got to toot your own horn. You've got to, when there's an all hands and your team has launched something, you've got to grab the mic and be up there saying, yes, we did these things and it led to those results, and yay, my team, and call them out by name. When you don't do this, your colleagues don't understand the role that design plays. Product managers are stereotypically more extroverted, at least in many of the contexts I've been in, and they're very comfortable getting on the mic and talking. So then they get all the shine. You want to make sure you and your team get some of that shine as well. Sometimes this is referred to as the shit umbrella. You want to be a protector for your team. All kinds of stuff is coming at your team. There is nothing more the rest of the organization wants to do than randomize your team, spread them too thin, have them work on too many things. Not intentionally, but they're just a lot. There's always more demand for design than there is capacity for design. One of the truisms, you will never have enough designers. So how do you manage that? What do you do about it? You need to protect your team. And it means in a few ways. If your team is doing good work, and say an executive just swoops and poops on it, you need to fight for your team's good work. Too often I have seen executives rail against design output, and the design leader might not have actually worked on the project themselves, right, but is overseeing or managing the team, steps back and just lets that fire rain right down on their team from the executive, like, well, yeah, I told them, but they didn't listen, and you can't do that. Can't do that. You have to fight for your team's good work. You have to make your executives understand why it's good work, because they don't know better. And one of the truisms, literally no one outside your team understands what it takes to do good design, and so you have to continue to educate them. And then you have to learn, as this came up at the Design Up Summit a couple weeks ago, a phrase that I hadn't heard before, which is the power of the positive no. You have to learn how to say no. You are going to be asked to do more than your team is capable of doing, and you have to figure out ways to say no. You can't let your team get spread too thin. You need to maintain their focus on what matters. And so, again, that's part of the responsibility as a design leader. One of the implications of this is you're going to let stuff go out the door that no designer has touched. Some of you probably got a little shiver when I said that. You are going to need to let stuff ship that no designer has touched. It is better to do that than try to put a quarter or a half of a designer on something, but then they're spread too thin, and whatever's actually important is not getting the attention it needs, and thus isn't being delivered at the level of quality that it ought to be. You also need to be relentless. So in the same way that you are going to need to tell other people no, you cannot accept other people telling you no. It's an irony. Because people all around your organization are going to tell you no. No, you can't have your own conference room or your own workspace. That's crazy. No, you can't have Macintoshes. That's crazy. No, you can't have that software. That's crazy. No, we can't pay that much. That's insane, et cetera. You're just going to be told no all day long by people within your organization, and you can't just say, oh, okay. You have to push back. You have to fight back. You have to be relentless. You have to figure out ways to make other folks understand why these things are necessary in order for your team to do good work. Okay, we're going to quickly talk about the architect. So the architect comes up when you're scaling from a design team, you can all sit around a table, into a design org, right? At some point, you're going to grow. And as you grow, you need to adopt a kind of architect mentality that allows you to scale the organization, that allows the organization to thrive even as it gets bigger than you can just directly manage and engage in. This is Julia Morgan, a pioneering California architect. I live in the East Bay, Oakland, Berkeley. She actually did a lot of work in my neighborhood. So I'm not going to sweat the charter because I already talked about it, but draft a charter. Charters are essential for an organization to scale because they help establish the culture for that organization. You need to be intentional about how you organize. And that doesn't mean just do whatever product does or engineering does, and they're in squads, so I guess we're embedded in squads now. That might not be right for you. You have to figure out your own organizational model that makes sense as it grows. This comes from the book, the org design book, and then the workshop that I'll be teaching tomorrow will get into this, right? I'm a fan of organizing my design teams by customers and their journeys, regardless of whether or not product is organized that way as well, right? Product teams are often organized by product or features, but the journeys tend to cross them. So I organize my design teams in that way. That might not be right for you, but you should be intentional about it. Don't just accept whatever others have done in other roles. I'm going to build this one quickly. I'm a big fan of levels frameworks, and I find that when I teach my workshop, we end up talking about this for hours. I won't go into great detail here, but the idea is you need to have a consistent way of understanding what junior, mid-level, senior, lead, manager, director looks like across your organization. Because it becomes this kind of core service that ends up plugging into so many other aspects of your team as you're trying to scale. It helps you recruit and hire better. It helps you staff teams better, and it helps you grow your team better. And without it, all of that stuff is being done ad hoc, and it gets messy, and you have people with the same job title, but with different levels of experience, different responsibilities. Again, people are looking at each other, why is that person a senior and I'm a mid-level? I'm just as good as they are, I have more experience as they are, et cetera, et cetera. You need to avoid that. So I've come to believe that design quality is subjective. You can measure design effects. It depends on if you want to call that quality. And we can have a very long philosophical disquisition about that. But there is no universally understood definition of design quality. Engineering has that, right? You can have uptime, and you can have no bugs, and you can have certain throughputs and et cetera. Like there's ways that you can measure engineering quality that are industry standard and well understood. We don't have that in design. So every organization needs to figure out what their definition of design quality is. And if you're going to scale, you need to make that explicit through things like brand personality characteristics, experience principles. This came up a lot last night at the Shopify event that I helped moderate. We're talking about scaling teams. Both Anne and Amy talked about the importance of experience principles as a means to help a growing design team have a shared understanding. Obviously, design systems, but there's going to be subjectivity. You can't avoid that. So you have to decide what looks good to you, which might be different, right? The Dropbox aesthetic is going to be different from a PayPal aesthetic, is going to be different from a Facebook aesthetic, and one is not any better than the other. And so you just need to figure out what does it mean, what do we call good, what is quality in our organization. And as you scale, you're going to need to establish design operations. You're going to need people who are dedicated to helping run the engine that is the team. In one context I've been working in recently, I refer to the design teams and the designers and what they do as the content of the work, and I refer to design operations as the enablement of the work. All the stuff that provides a context that allows the designers to do their best work. Design operations becomes important as something to be very explicit about and not just kind of hacking away at. So, coach, diplomat, champion, architect, that's a lot, right? I'm basically saying that every design leader needs to do all of these things. If your team is less than 10, you can kind of maybe not be an architect, but everyone has to be those other three, and that's a lot to ask for. Frankly, I think it's kind of not fair, but I think it speaks to the nascency of design leadership right now, that we need design leaders to be able to do all three, because you never quite know where things are going to come from, and you need to be nimble enough to be able to manage down, manage across, and manage up. And part of the reason I teach this or present this is I think it can be helpful as a self-assessment. You all as design leaders probably can understand, you could tell me which ones you're good at and which ones you're not. And that becomes room to grow in terms of those ones that you're not. These are all skills. That's something else that I think was reflected on earlier and something I said at the end of the prior talk I gave. I don't even know how to talk about that. The skills that brought you here are not the skills that are going to carry you forward. You can learn all of these things. These are leadership skills, interpersonal skills that you learn in the same way that you learned whatever your design skill, research skill, content skill was. These are all learnable, but it is a craft. Leadership is a craft that you have to develop and work on. And so I'm hoping this provides a framework for thinking, for organizing it, because it can feel like there's just a lot coming at you as a leader. So I hope this framework helps you organize that. So thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Peter. Do you want to take a question?
It's only keeping them from lunch.
I know, okay. So we'll take one quick question. And also, there was no surprises that your talk will be amazing, but the first part when you walked off, I got really scared. I was like, that's done.
Okay, 6 minutes, everybody.
Okay, so we will take one of the more upvoted questions. So we have one question. Hey, Peter, how do you structure a team when the budget is defined by the product structure? Your model seems intuitive, but feels like a challenge to fund.
Okay, so that's a big question. So design often in organizations is going to be funded in relationship to some other function, unfortunately. In an ideal world, there would be a mandate for what needs to be designed. The design leader can go back to their leadership and say, oh, you want us to do this much work? I'm going to need this many designers. Sometimes that happens, but rarely. Usually it's ratio-based, right? And kind of depending on the company. What is it? IBM is aiming for, some of these companies aim for like 1 designer to 1 product manager to 8 engineers, right? And that ends up kind of driving design hiring. And that will be true at the outset. As you, over time, prove your value, you'll start realizing that you can get, your headcount will get decoupled from others. So if you're in that situation, I don't quite know how to answer it beyond just saying, get as much as you can, work with what you can. You will likely, if there was one truism if you had to say you only get one, it probably would have been, you will never have enough designers. That is the truism of all truisms for design organizations and design leaders. And so given that, your responsibility as a leader is to focus their efforts on what matters. That's why the charter is so important. Not an intake process. No, we don't like intake processes. But a charter is so important so that you can focus your efforts on what matters, demonstrate value through doing good work on what matters, even if that means 75% of what's going on is not getting a designer because they wouldn't give you enough headcount. Do that 25% really well. Show what it looks like when you do it really well. Show the results of focused design work. And then use that as a way to continue to argue for more and more headcount over time. I hope that answers the question. If that doesn't, feel free to find me at lunch or throughout the day or at the party tonight.
Absolutely. Let's have a big round of applause for Peter.